So if you're like me, you might be wondering what the heck's been going on with New World. It's been a while since the preview event that took place at the end of August on what was supposed to be the second scheduled launch date for the game, where we got a little over a week to check out how it was in its current state. Like, after all these years of development, how is New World looking up until this point? And I would say it went decently overall. Like, it was certainly a mixed bag of opinions. I would say maybe tilting on the negative direction, but I think that myself and many other people hold the opinion that the game shows a lot of potential. I know that early on there was a ton of excitement with the game raking in pretty high numbers on both Twitch and YouTube. I think largely from people not only excited for a new game, but the MMO crowd always clinging on to whatever's coming next and hoping that it's going to be something good. And yeah, I think it was a decent showcase, and potential is probably the word that I would use. But again, it's been a while. That took place at the end of August. It's been several months now, and unless you've been following closely, things have been fairly quiet, but there's actually been a lot going on behind the scenes, and there's been some rather significant changes and adjustments, and that's kind of what I want to go through here in this video. So first off, I gotta say that right after the preview event, they put up this Thank You Adventurers blog, in which they basically said, hey, we received a lot of feedback, a very high volume of feedback, suggestions, and data, and that they were planning to focus on adding some more mid and end game content, which is largely a big area of complaint and criticism for the game. In addition to that, features that are just fun. In particular, they are working to add more in the areas of more game modes, more landmass, AI variety, as well as quest variety. Those were both sorely lacking, and that they were planning at that point to have an alpha in November to continue to develop and test the game. This one wouldn't be as widely open as the August preview event, but people could still register to join. And it's also worth noting that the alphas that have been taking place have largely been under NDA up until today. Well, they're all still under NDA. So how were the subsequent months throughout the fall and up until this day? What has changed and what's new, and what should we expect for New World? So let's start off with the October update. They actually went ahead and started the alpha test a little ahead of schedule towards the end of October. Again, this was a confidential test, which is probably why you didn't see or hear much about it. And although it was under NDA, they shared a lot of the changes that were being made through this blog post. So first off, they added a brand new weapon, the Spear, which is a melee weapon that offers both long distance pierce damage as well as some range capabilities, and also scales primarily with dexterity. It's got the Zoner tree that's all about keeping enemies at a distance with throwing spears, and the Impeller tree that is about closing the gap and quick attacks. Per weapon cooldowns saw a change, so now at this point, every weapon in the game is going to have independent cooldowns, which will let you use all three abilities on one weapon and then switch to another weapon and use all of its abilities. This is a pretty drastic difference from the preview event, in where if you used an ability on one weapon, its cooldown would lock abilities in that slot on other weapons. So that it really was restrictive in the sense that it focused a lot of the combat on the basic melee elements of light attack, heavy attack, blocking, and dodging. In and of itself, not a bad idea, but because their basic combat is rather, well, basic, it's pretty rudimentary, there wasn't much finesse and nuance in it, at least on the PvE side of things. People wanted to use their abilities more often, and adjusting and removing the shared cooldowns between weapons is a step in that direction. They also made it so that you can dodge roll without stamina after being struck in multiple consecutive reactions to basically combat the stun locking that took place. Any abilities that get interrupted or canceled before the active frames of the attack will no longer be put on cooldown, so if you get interrupted, you can still use those abilities as long as it wasn't actually used. And we saw a big nerf to the hatchet, as well as nerf to the life staff's movement skill, and they also made it so that every melee weapon in the game can backstab, and they added in a new threat system for enemy AI, and just did some tuning adjustments to things like leveling speed and questing experience. So those are the adjustments that happened in October. But then November rolled around, and this was actually a pretty exciting time. So I got to take an early look look during the November update at some of the changes, which included a brand new high-level zone called Reekwater, the addition of the fishing trade skill, along with some quality of life changes with adjustments to enemy AI, difficulty in the game, overall changes to combat, as well as tweaking to the game's user interface. So I got 3 hours of hands-on time mid-November. There is a video out already for my coverage of that, and I'm not going to go super in-depth, but I want to touch on, I guess, the major points of interest from that event and from that video. So first, let's talk about the spear. The spear was added in the October update. In November, I actually got to check it out. So 2 skill trees, again, the Impeller, which is all about closing the gap, and the Zoner, which is about keeping enemies at a distance. Now, under the Impeller tree, there's the Skewer skill. This has you charge forward, strike a target, and kick them back, as well as applying a bleed. There's Perforate, which performs 3 quick piercing strikes that apply a rend debuff. Vault Kick, where you plant your spear, vault forward, and kick the target. This one looks pretty badass, and it also does a significant stamina damage, as well as applying an exhaust debuff. So that's the 3 skills in the Impeller tree. Then we've got the Zoner tree. The one skill that I actually used in this tree was the Javelin, and this just has you grabbing your spear, aiming it, and letting you throw it at any target. I found this incredibly useful because there's no ammo associated with it. It's just the cooldown, and you have this indefinitely usable ranged ability. There's also the Cyclone ability, where it's a spinning attack that knocks enemies back, and the Sweep ability that sweeps targets' legs, knocking them down on the ground. So I played around with the spear a bunch, and I gotta say I really liked it, especially because I love having melee and range options. So I went with the spear and the bow because both of them primarily scale off dexterity, and that was just having me do some massive damage. I just went full dexterity as much as humanly possible and was just tearing through enemies. Now my health pool was on the low side, but glass cannon builds are kind of fun for me, so that's what I went with. And yeah, I really enjoyed using the spear. It was nice to have a new weapon in the mix, and I think they should keep adding more and more weapons. And as we'll get to in the following update, they are apparently. Now let's though talk about Reekwater, that brand new zone that got added. They're calling this a endgame zone for players level 58 to 60. This one is located east of Everfall and south of Weaver's Fen. It's a swampy region. It's got the kind of a bayou feel. There's a lot of ferns, moss, willowy trees, shallow waters, and mist everywhere. Just you're surrounded with mist. Now the main settlement in Reekwater is called Reekwater Hamlet. This is this dilapidated fishing village made up of bridges and walkways that are constructed of a ton of wooden planks and ropes, and it's the whole town kind of has this tree house feel, and the layout and look of it are quite different from a lot of the other zone settlements in the game. Again, another complaint that people had was that so many of the settlements in the different zones looked identical. In fact, many were pretty much copy-paste in terms of their layout and building placement and all of that. This is partially due to the fact that pre-constructed towns are a fairly new thing in New World's development. About a year and a half ago, players actually built the towns, like you would construct the buildings and the walls and everything, and then they changed that up. They said no more player construction of anything, we're building our own towns. So it's not surprising that they had a bunch of copy-pasted towns, but even though it's not surprising, it's still disappointing. So mixing up the town's looks and layouts, I think, is important, and that's what they've done, at least here in Reekwater, as far as I can tell. Now let's talk about the brand new kind of fun mechanic of fishing. So it's a thing where you collect fish. You know what fishing is. You basically, as you're near water, you will push F3 and this will pull out your fishing pole, and then you will click to cast your line, at which point a bobber will appear in the water, and then when you get a little nibble on that bobber, you click again to hook the fish, and this at this point will start this tug of war mini game mechanic where you'll hold it down to reel the fish in, but you want to release it before the tension gets too high because yes, the line can break, and you just keep doing this back and forth until you actually reel in the fish. There's going to be over 40 different types of fish in the game amongst the different territories and water types, and they're also broken down into rarities with common, rare, and ultra rare fish. You can craft fishing poles, gather bait, you can break fish down into parts, and fish will be used for various crafting recipes in the game. Now, as I mentioned during the October update, they mentioned how they changed how ability cooldowns work, and when I checked out the November update, I got to try that out for myself. So yeah, independent weapon cooldowns. Again, in the past, say if I pressed the Q ability on my hatchet, it would put the Q ability on both my other weapons on cooldown. Now I can use the Q ability, the swap to my bow, use that Q ability, swap to my staff, use that Q ability. You have the full access to all of your weapons and each of their abilities on their own independent cooldowns. And I gotta say, I really liked it. I know there's people who wanted kind of the more action-focused, light, heavy attack, block, dodge. I just don't think what they have in New World is nearly as good as a game like, say, Dark Souls. The intricacies of weaving light and heavy attacks and single and dual wielding weapons and the drop attacks and dodge attacks and back attack. Like, there's just so much depth to the basic melee combat in Dark Souls, whereas New World's basic melee combat was basically just spamming light attacks and occasionally dodging. Again, we're talking the PvE side of things. PvP had a little more depth, but on PvE, the basic combat system just didn't feel good, and using abilities feels much better. So I really enjoyed the fact that I would run up to a group of enemies and start off by charging in with my spear, triple jabbing, and then throwing it at that enemy or another one in the distance. And then I could swap to my bow and instantly cast my spread or rapid shot, and then I could swap to my life staff and either blink away or heal if I needed to. And then rinse and repeat. And it just felt really good, again, to have access to all of my skills. There are a lot of people that are worried about the game devolving into this kind of constant weapon swapping meta, I guess. And I totally get that. Now, you don't have to constantly switch your weapons. You could just use your abilities and do the basic attack system if you like, but people will tend to gravitate to what is most effective. And if constantly weapon swapping, the lighting in this video is going to be all fucked up. It's just like the sun's coming. This is not my permanent setup. This is a temporary thing. Anyways, there's people who preferred just like not a heavy use of skills and more of a use of the basic combat mechanics. But personally, I kind of like the direction they're going in at this point a little bit better. I ultimately don't know if this is going to be the best solution in this game, but I did like having access to all 9 of my skills in fights. I also am of the opinion that they could go more in a direction of what they do in ESO or Guild Wars 2, where don't give us 3 weapons, give us 2 weapons, but just have more skills available per weapon. Give us 4 or 5 skills per weapon, just 2 weapons to swap between. I think that'd be pretty good. Or they could keep doing what they're doing. Also, with this update, there were new enemies added to the game. They added swamp dryads and fiends, undead brutes, creepers. They added the elite boss enemies, Sufferance of the Elders and Protector of the Source. There was also a further update to the threat system where healing and blocking now generate threat. And the elite enemy system was added in general. Basically, they're saying here that they're going to be assigning 1 to 3 traits to enemies that will vary up the gameplay by enhancing either their offensive or defensive abilities, or adding utility, like they could gain an AoE frost aura, or they could explode upon death. Just things to make these elite enemies more challenging than having a larger health pool and dealing more damage. They also added target locking for healing for support players to make healing your allies a little easier, and a critical hit system was added to the game, as well as some further balance adjustments for the musket, life staff, and the sword. So that was everything that happened in the November update, as well as the preview event that I got to check out. And even though the generally ongoing alpha is under NDA, part of this preview event was the fact that we got to record and show some of that footage, which you're seeing here in this video, but also in my other video if you want more coverage of this particular update. But now let's go ahead and move on to the last of the current updates. So in the December update, they did some tuning to the core combat systems, as well as adding a new weapon and shield type and introducing PvP dueling. So the new weapon that they've added is the Great Axe. This is a 2-handed melee weapon that excels at large sweeping attacks. It's got the Marauder skill tree, which is about high damage and multi-hit abilities, and the Reaper tree, which is about crowd control and escape prevention. They added tower shields to the game, which they are calling the biggest and most powerful shield in New World. I don't know, does this mean it's got the highest stats, or is it just visually the largest and this is some like lore or whatever? I don't know exactly. They were a little vague here, but also there were some changes to how shields work. Shields will now add to your armor in addition to their block chance, but this only applies when the shield is unsheathed, not when it's just sitting on your back, and shields will now also apply to your total equipment weight. PvP duels were added to the game as a consequence-free way to practice PvP. These can be initiated by hovering over a player's name in the chat or social menus and then clicking invite to duel. And outside interference, they say, will end a duel. Hopefully they're talking about like if you run into some PvE mobs in the wilderness, not like other players spam an attack at you, because otherwise dueling will just get constantly griefed by other people. But something that's really cool here is that they have the ability to duel 1v1 or in groups of up to 5 players per side. That's actually really cool. I like that. It's like a mini little skirmish thing, which is pretty neat. And then towards the end here, they talked a bit about kind of their overall vision for the game's combat and adjustments they've made to go in line with that. So they say their vision for combat in New World is that it will be skill-based, action-oriented, with a visceral, high-impact feel while allowing for depth with its systems and builds. Now, during all of the testing through the preview event and the alphas that have happened since then, they've had some major points of feedback about the game and its combat, and they mention what they think, basically how they're addressing it. So one of the first big points of feedback was that stunlock from other players or AI isn't fun, and for this, they have actually removed the ability for basic attacks to interrupt a combatant. So no more light attack spam stun locking people in PvP or PvE, I presume. I guess the only lockdown stun lock type things will be coming from actual skills. And as far as I know, there are at least a few skills in the game that can still stun or CC players, but basic attack locking players down, it's not going to be happening anymore. Players said that they wanted to use their abilities more often, and of course with this we had the cooldown change, the no longer shared cooldowns between weapons. They say that weapon, block, and hit detection needed improvement, and making improvements in this hit detection as well as synchronization is something they're very focused on. This is one of the largest issues you have with these non-tab target games in a large open space. The more players you add, the more desyncing issues that you run into typically, and so they're aware of this and they're planning to work on it. Weapons needed bouncing, which they have consistently been doing. Players complained that healing other players was too hard, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, we now have the targeted healing for the life staff to make it easier. There was complaints that body blocking made range damage inconsistent. So for the change for this, they say they introduced this dynamic scaling for enemies, where any elite and high profile targets will now be easier to hit at a range, even when in melee combat with other players. So this doesn't address getting body blocked from your allies against regular enemies, but at least with high value targets, you'll be able to hit them much easier, even if your friends are in the way. And then finally, ability input needs to allow players to react to changing combat conditions. And for this, they say that they've cleaned up the input buffers to make ability use more consistent and allow players to better react in combat. For example, you can now cancel out of attacks, abilities, and dodges much sooner. They say that looking ahead, they will continue to refine combat by adding a larger variety of weapons, fine-tuning abilities and skills, making adjustments to existing systems, as well as adding new ones. So those are all of the updates, a rather exhaustive look at everything that's been happening with New World behind the scenes over these past few months. So I guess the last thing is what's next, like what's coming up in the future for New World. Well, they are going to continue alpha testing. In fact, I expect that there will be a new monthly update at some point in the middle to late portion of this month. And currently, as far as we know, they are still planning to release the game in the spring of 2021. Now, we didn't get an exact month, probably because they don't want to run into the same situation with the last two launches. First, they said the game was launching in May of 2020. They missed that. Then they said August 2020. They missed that. So now they're just saying spring. Call me crazy. I think they should have just said 2021. Like, don't even give a freaking season. Just take your time, make the game as good as you can, and release it when it's ready. But I assume whenever that release date is going to be, as we get closer to launch, there'll probably be another kind of preview event or an open beta, or at the very least, they'll let you play through pre-orders. I'm almost certain. They're definitely at some point going to need a big portion of the player base to jump in and try out all, because a lot has changed since August to now. Like I just went over, a lot has changed. They're going to want a large volume of feedback and not just their kind of small scale under NDA alpha testing that's going on right now. But there you go. That's what's been going on with New World. A lot has changed, and I hope for the better. It's, again, maybe the only new MMO coming out in 2021, so I'll continue to pay attention to it and hope that it turns out good. But that is it for today. Thank you guys for watching. It's a different setup. I'm in a new place, and it's gonna happen again pretty soon in probably the next video that you watch. I'm in the middle of a move, but once things get settled, we'll be back in a good spot, putting out some more videos, and maybe I'll take a break from WoW. I played too much WoW nowadays. All right, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you later.